top cop who put his badge on the line for justice.
You know the name Doug Poppa?
Yes, I do. God bless Doug Poppa, an honest cop.
I was elated, of course, but then as he testified, I was somewhat concerned for him, because I knew that they were probably going to crucify that man.
Sometimes the truth has a price. That may be the lesson of a Virginia police officer who says, in trying to do the right thing, he ended up paying for it.
The message you're sending is, see, we did it, Doug. You don't come out, you don't buck the system. No matter what the reason is, you just can basically keep your mouth shut. But if I wouldn't do it all over again, I would take the badge and I would leave it on somebody's desk and get out of police work. Because the day I can't tell the truth because somebody's pressuring me, and the day the system doesn't want me to tell the truth because somebody's pressuring me, is the day I'd leave the badge on the desk and walk away.
Poppa was fired for insubordination. One man who confronted truth and consequences.
From Las Vegas, Nevada, this is Doug Poppa, Truth and Consequences podcast.
The incident in question dating back to 1995.
They made me come over by their car and lift my skirt and show my privates. And then they took me to the front of the car and they went through my purse and they found a small amount of crack cocaine. And they said if I wanted to go, that I would have to eat that. And so I ate it, and it caused really bad sores in my mouth.
Kevin was laughing about the whole deal. Bill Stoops walks up to me, points his finger at me, and says, I got you now. You're one of us. If we go down, you go down. It's so good to have something over your head. We own you.
Did you ever ask a woman while you were working as an officer to see her genitals?
Never.
Were you ever present when someone else did, another officer?
Never. No chance in hell that I ever passed that test.
She passed.
I don't know. I never got to see her polygraph results, nor did I get to see how it is that they pushed her into it.
The I-Team spoke with then Sergeant Mark Tavares Friday. He said he had no reason to believe the event didn't happen, but he now believes Stoops committed the acts and is to blame, not McMahill. He said he had no reason to believe the event didn't happen, but he now believes Stoops committed the acts and is to blame, not McMahill. Were you ever present when someone else did, another officer?
Never.
He said he had no reason to believe the event didn't happen, but he now believes Stoops committed the acts and is to blame, not McMahill. Were you ever present when someone else did, another officer?
Never.
Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 109, Truth and Consequences podcast. I'm your host, Doug Poppa. That was a excerpt of the interview that was done by 8 News Now I-Team. That was Vanessa Murphy doing the interviews. Occurred on April 1st. That's when they aired it. And I'm going to get into that in a second because I want to reiterate and bring up some stuff that I didn't talk about in the other podcast. I believe I forgot. But the title of this podcast is McMahill Stood By, Laughed as Female Officer Was Sexually Harassed. Okay? Before I get to that, I want to say it's on the last podcast. I don't know why I keep doing this. I incorrectly identified retired Las Vegas Metro Police Assistant Sheriff and current candidate for Clark County Sheriff Tom Roberts as a retired Deputy Chief. Roberts retired at the rank of Assistant Sheriff. I've done that twice already in the podcast, and I don't know why I keep referring to him as a retired Deputy Chief. Tom Roberts, who's a candidate for Sheriff also for Clark County, is a retired Assistant Sheriff. So I just want to get that clear and get that out of the way. Okay. I'm going to put something up on the screen here. This was it's an excerpt from a Las Vegas Review-Journal article going back to 2002. And they're discussing the civil suit that then police officer, Las Vegas Metro police officer, Jennifer Gale Clampett, filed against the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. It was about 7 years after the 1995 incident. I want to put it up on the screen here and read an excerpt because it can be pertinent to something that I'm going to say here in a second. So let me get this up over here. Okay. Let me get down here. Put me up over here. Okay, I don't want that one. Get rid of that one. Put me up over here. Okay. So I'll pull me back up on the screen in a minute. But it says in a memo written, this is coming from the Las Vegas Review-Journal article from 2002. And it says in a memo written in August 1995 by Captain Steve Franks, who investigated Clampett's allegations of sexual harassment, Franks said the entire series of events could be laid at Hood's feet. He's talking about Clampett's then sergeant on her squad, Gary Hood. And then they're quoting Franks. And it says, it was his inaction that caused this feeling and mood to prevail, which set in motion the acceptable tolerance, which snowballed into a sustainable complaint against Officer Stoops. And then it says, wrote Franks, who is now a lieutenant. Then it says, later in the memo, Franks wrote, quote, it is appalling this type of behavior ever occurred by officers on our department against another officer. It is also equally galling that, quote, common sense, unquote, did not prevail, and we had not a single officer with the moral courage to stand up to this behavior. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, Steve Franks is referring to Jennifer Gale Clampett's male squad members. She was the only female on her squad in 1995. And when he talks about no single officer with moral courage that stood up and defended her, one of the people he's talking about is then Las Vegas Metro Police Officer Kevin McMahill, who's now running for Clark County Sheriff. He was one of the officers who stood by and thought the sexual harassment comments made by William Stoops on the squad directed against then police officer Jennifer Gale Clampett, who retired as a sergeant in 2008. He didn't do anything. And he is running for sheriff. Like I said in these other podcasts, Gale Clampett, Jennifer Gale Clampett's not running for sheriff. None of her former squad members are running for sheriff. Who's running for sheriff is documented liar and documented pervert by the police department's own Internal Affairs Bureau investigation. I'm going to put that up on the screen here for a second. This is the document that I released in the previous podcast. Those are the results of the Internal Affairs investigation against then police officer Kevin McMahill in 1995. The Internal Affairs Bureau investigation sustained the charges of conduct unbecoming an officer and neglect of duty, and also untruthfulness during the investigation. He was sustained for untruthfulness. Now, before I get to something else, let me put this up on the screen because I talked about it the other day and I got some emails from people who did not know what I was talking about. Okay? This is the, let me go off the screen here for a second so you could see it. Okay? When I talked about the Giglio-Brady list, and that is a list compiled usually by a prosecutor's office or a police department containing the names and details of law enforcement officers who have had sustained incidents of either untruthfulness, criminal convictions, candor issues, or some other type of issue placing their credibility into question. And we know from the Internal Affairs investigation that I just had on the screen here again, the charges of untruthfulness was sustained against Kevin McMahill. So he is a documented liar, then throughout his 30-year police career, and he will be a documented liar. His credibility is in question if he's elected sheriff. That is something that is sustained from 1995, and those charges were never dropped. Just to confuse people here. I know people getting confused in trying to say this. The charges against Kevin McMahill in 1995 stand to this day. Now, he was not fired back in 1995, but the charges were never dropped. They were sustained by the Internal Affairs Bureau investigation. So I just want to get this out. Now I want to go back to what I just talked about with the Franks memo. Let me get it back on the screen here. Okay. This is what the Journal said. It's a typed version of what their article said from 1995. Okay. So now I ask myself, okay, well, that's fine. That's a memo that Steve Frank said that during that civil hearing in 2002, which was seven years after the 1995 incident, they're talking about a complaint that Jennifer Clampett made against, it was made against her sergeant, which was Gary Hood, because he failed to investigate and do anything to the officers on her squad when she was the recipient of unwanted sexual harassing comments made by the male members of her squad. Now, well, how do we know that? Well, I'm going to post this for the first time. I haven't posted this before. Get it up on the screen here. This is the this is the Las Vegas Metro Police report. Okay. On Gary Hood. Okay. And it says that the complainant up at the top, let me get rid of myself here for a second so you can see this clear. Okay. This is from 1995. Get this on here so I could read what I'm doing here. Okay. It's the report. Okay. And the body of the report says, this is against Gary Hood. And it says, allegations type of complaint. Number 1, harassment and or discrimination, prevention and complaint process. And number 2, neglect of duty. And it says, it is alleged that on 3 separate incidents, you overheard officers on your squad make sexual remarks toward a female officer that constituted harassment and created a hostile work environment. These remarks were, quote, snail trails, quote, camel toes, and quote, cunt. You did not stop these remarks from occurring, counsel the officers on types of prohibited behavior, nor act to investigate a complaint brought to your attention. It is alleged that officers on your squad were causing disharmony explicitly directed toward a female officer, and you failed to act. Ladies and gentlemen, the female officer that Stavros Anthony, the lieutenant from the Southeast Area Command, is telling in this document here, Gary Hood, that he failed to take action because Jennifer Clampett did not want those remarks occurring. She told Sergeant Hood about it in 1995. He failed to take any action. And Jennifer Clampett told me, and was also, I believe, in the civil document from 2002, that while William Stoops was making those comments to her, snail trails, which was a comment about her sweating from the groin area, camel toes against the uniform that maybe showed the outline of a groin area, and cunt, which is a derogatory, everybody knows, it's a derogatory comment to a female, call him a cunt. And those comments were made by William Stoops while Kevin McMahill and his squad members laughed and thought it was funny, and nobody stood up, like I just read in that Steve Franks memo from the lawsuit, and said, this is wrong, shut up. Nobody stood up, including Kevin McMahill, the man who wants to be sheriff of Clark County and the head of the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. Now, why is this important? Let me get to one more thing here. Now, those were the allegations, okay? They conducted an investigation, and based on that investigation, the charges against Sergeant Hood, because they interviewed people on the squad, were sustained. And in August 4th, 1995, you see a signature on the document, and then on August 12th, 1995, the investigation was completed. It's got Stavros Anthony, the lieutenant, his lieutenant, he was a sergeant, Gary Hood, and it says corrective action. Right above the box, it said sustained, so the charges were sustained, and he was given 20 hours suspension, no option. I mean, that's what he got, 20-hour suspension for failing to take any action based on Clampett's complaints against the squad members. It was investigated, and the charges were sustained against Gary Hood, and he was given 20-hour suspension, no option, and then training on the back. And I believe the training on the back is sexual harassment training and hostile work environment training and stuff like that. So now we know that, ladies and gentlemen, 2 complaints, and I talked about this on another podcast, that were brought to the attention of the police department in 1995 by Jennifer Clampett. This one against the sergeant because Kevin McMahill and his squad members thought it was a joke and funny while she was being sexually harassed with those comments, snail trails, camel toes, and cunt, and neither one of those guys did anything to intervene and say this is not right. They laughed, including Kevin McMahill. Now, why do I think this is important? Ladies and gentlemen, it goes to the mindset of Kevin McMahill. He's the one that's running for Clark County Sheriff. Remember, this was the second complaint that was filed by Jennifer Clampett in 1995. The other complaint was the investigation that was also sustained on the comments reference to the neglect of duty, the conduct on becoming an officer, and truthfulness, which was based on the 1995 incident where Kevin McMahill and Stoops were there with Carrie Lance. McMahill said, "Show me your snatch, show me your vagina." Stoops forced her to eat crack cocaine, the rock of cocaine. Jennifer Clampett was there. She reported that to a supervisor, and then she reported it to Internal Affairs. And we know an investigation was conducted, and those charges were sustained. So 2 complaints filed by Jennifer Clampett in 1995 were sustained against Kevin McMahill and Stoops, and against our Sergeant Hood for this second complaint where he stood by and did nothing when his officers were demeaning and sexually harassing Jennifer Clampett. So when Kevin McMahill says, ladies and gentlemen, that nothing, get back on the screen here, what happened to me? Okay, that he was not present, he never told a woman to expose her genitals, he was never present when another officer told her to expose her genitals. We saw the interview clip again that I played again from Channel 8 that was aired on April 1st when she asked him, "Were you present when any other officer did that?" And he says no. Okay? Ladies and gentlemen, we know he's lying, okay, because the charges were sustained against him. And I got a lot of emails from people, and they said, you know what? The guy was obviously a pervert back in 1995, and he's obviously lying. But then when they watched that Channel 8 interview, they said he's still lying to this day. Because you heard, and I talked about this at the other podcast, when Vanessa Murphy from the I-Team, 8 News Now, interviewed now retired captain, who was a sergeant at the time, Mark Tavares, who did the internal affairs investigation, and his documents that we know, because I published them in the previous podcast, the charges were sustained. And he says now, 20-something years later, that he thinks Stoops did it all. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you know the emails I got from people, you know what they said? Well, if that's what he wants to say now, Tavares, that he thinks Stoops did it all, when he's talking about Stoops did it all, he's saying maybe McMahill didn't make the comment to Carrie Lance, "Show me a snatch," although he stood there and didn't do anything about it, and didn't do anything when Stoops forced it to eat crack. But Tavares is now saying that he believes, for some reason, 20-something years later, Stoops said it all. Well, that comment by Tavares proves in 2022, right now, not 1995, right now again, that Kevin McMahill is a liar. Because if Tavares is saying, now I think Stoops may have said everything and made the remark, told her to eat the crack, and not McMahill, he's saying the incident happened, but he believes Stoops did it. And you heard McMahill in April 1st interview 2022 tell Vanessa Murphy that he was never there when any other cop. He didn't do it when any other cop said to any woman, expose the genitals. So in 2022, based on Tavares' statement, which I said I don't believe what he's saying, but let's just give him let's say for a second that he woke up one day and he thinks Stoops said it all. Here's the point I'm trying to make, and here's the point that people made in the email. That proves now in 2022 that Kevin McMahill is still a documented liar. Because if Tavares thinks that Stoops did it all in June of 1995, and McMahill said he wasn't there when any of that happened, then that proves McMahill is still lying in 2022. Now, let's just say that people say, I don't believe Clampett. Well, Clampett had 2 complaints she filed, and both of those complaints were investigated, and the charges were sustained against the people she made the complaint on. There's no ends up or buts. These documents from 1995 that I put on my podcast prove that. But let's go back and look at Steve Frank's, the McGee memo, okay? Now, let me up on the screen here. Okay, that's the memo. Why is that doing that? Okay, here we go here. Okay. Let me get my copy here so I can read this. Okay, I don't know where it's at, but anyway, this is the memo that Franks wrote to McGee, calling the conduct atrocious, idiotic, and embarrassment to the police department. But what he's talking to McKee about, who's a deputy chief, is that they wanted to bring Jennifer Clampett, up on charges because she stood by and didn't do anything, did not intervene, while McMahill and Stoops did that atrocious, idiotic comment, according to Captain Steve Frank's remarks in 1995, and she didn't do anything. And I said later on, I don't believe they did do the charges because they said that Stoops turned around and threatened her. But my point being is this: if you believe Kevin McMahill to this day, he's saying that the incident never happened. And I covered this in the other podcast. He's saying that the department basically lied because you heard the crazy, idiotic comments he said about why he failed the polygraph and all that stuff. I'm not going to go back and look at the podcast. That was all freaking nonsense. But he said, I don't know how they forced her into it, meaning taking the polygraph. So he's basically going after his own department. But what this memo proves, ladies and gentlemen, is that they wanted to bring Jennifer Clampett up on charges also of neglect of duty because she didn't intervene to stop what Stoops and McMahill were doing. Well, if you believe McMahill, even to this day in 2022, and you heard him in that interview that was aired with Channel 8 on April 1st, is that he wasn't there when anything like that happened. So the incident didn't happen. That's what he's still sticking to this day. Well, if nothing happened in 1995, and I said this the other day, number one, why would all 3 put on polygraphs and Stoops and McMahill failed and Clampett passed? But also, ladies and gentlemen, if the incident didn't happen, okay, if McMahill didn't make that comment to Carrie Lance, show me your snatch, show me your vagina, whatever he said, and Stoops didn't force her to eat rock cocaine in lieu of going to jail, then why were they thinking about bringing charges against Jennifer Clampett in 1995? For an incident that never happened? Kevin McMahill, ladies and gentlemen, is a documented liar and a documented pervert back in 1995 and to this very day. And he's still lying about it to this day. So I just want to make that point on that. A couple other things I got here. Brought up the Giglio. Okay. I want you to listen to, this is an interview that occurred today, April 11th. It was published today on a podcast. Ed Bernstein is a local lawyer, and he has a little podcast, and he brings people on, he interviews them. He interviewed Kevin McMahill, and this is a snippet of it. And I want to play this here for a second because it's important. So we'll get this over here.
Well, I started in 1990. Let's talk a little bit about you. I mean, how did you get involved in law enforcement? Why did you get involved? Where did you grow up? Yeah, so I grew up in Denver, Colorado. My dad was a Denver firefighter, and I wasn't the best kid in the whole world, and so I got shipped off to the military. I went to the United States Army for 3 years and served 2 of that in Korea. I came back down through here after I was stationed in Northern California and tested for Metro and got hired. And as you mentioned, I promoted all the way up through the ranks to the top non-elected official position.
Okay. You just heard what he said, okay? And this goes to what I talked about the other day. Bernstein asked him about why he became a cop. He said, came on the department in 1990, got out of the Army, started in 1990, and moved up the ladder in rank. Okay. Again, ladies and gentlemen, this is important. He is concealing his time that he left the police department, the Las Vegas Metro Police Department, for about 2 years. And we know from the documents that I pointed out in the last podcast, it said his hire date was December 5th of 1994, 7 months before the incident happened with Carrie Lance in June of 1995. And if you remember from podcast 102, when I had that memo that he wrote to now retired Sergeant Norm John, Las Vegas Metro Sergeant, in 2014, when he said, people are getting confused that I never left after the incident. We saw about the Carrie Lance incident. I had left before and came back 2 years later. And I said in episode 102, if he's correct on what he's saying on that, McMahill, that he was on the department and left for 2 years and then came back after 2 years, we know from his hire date on the documents that I had when they brought him up in these charges in 1995 are showing his hire date as December of 1994, 7 months prior, like I said, to the incident in June 1995 with Carrie Lance. So if he came back 2 years later, like he's telling Sergeant Norm John in 2014, then that means, like I said in episode 102, he left the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department somewhere around December of 1992, okay? Because he said 2 years, and I came back 2 years later, which would make it December of 1994. That is the hire date on the documents reference to the incident in 1995. And to this day, and I said, he's not addressing, and nobody's asking him. I did. I asked the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department for his records on his hire date, any time that he had a break in service, why he left the department, and when he came back. We know that at some point he was on the Denver Police Department. And I believe that happened after he left Metro for some unknown reason. And he says, I went back to Colorado, and while he was on there, he got on the Denver Police Department from what sources are telling me. And then for some reason, he left the Denver Police Department and came back to Nevada and got back on Metro. So one of the questions I have is, why is he concealing his time off Metro? Ladies and gentlemen, this guy wants to be the highest law enforcement officer in Clark County, Nevada. He wants to run the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. He needs to come out and he needs to document and show us why he left the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department for almost 2 years when he was hired in 1990, and then he was in Denver working on the Denver Police Department for some point in time, and then left Denver Police Department and came back. And I believe when he came back, because those documents prove that I had on the in episode 102, that his hire date shows is December 1994. So we have a gap, okay, in his tenure on the police department. He was not here from 1990 straight through, like he's leading people to believe, even in his bio. And I'll put the bio up on the screen for a second. But he also posted last year, he posted this picture of him with some other guys, and he says, the comment that I'm going to read now, he says, with that photograph of his squad in 1990, it was 12, okay, let's go to 13. Okay, he says this. This was on his social media last year, early this year. After serving in the United States Army for 3 years, I made the decision to join Metro. 31 years later, I want to continue my service to the community, blah, blah, blah. But I want to get this banner off the screen because this bottom part, I believe, is important. And then he says over here, if only 1990 Kevin knew what was in store. yes, Kevin, if only 1990 Kevin there, ladies and gentlemen, on the screen knew what was in store, because this guy is not telling the truth for some reason and is concealing his time away from Metro and his time when he went back in Colorado. And if he was on the Denver Police Department, we need to find out why he was no longer on the Denver Police Department, why he came back from Denver to Nevada and came back on Metro in December of 1994. This guy wants to run the police department, and there's something wrong here, and we need to get to the bottom of it. So that's what I wanted to get out. Okay, we did the, and this is not going to be a long podcast. It's 23, 30 hours out here. Like I said, April 11th, 2022, episode 109. So we heard him on Ed Bernstein again saying, I got out of the military, came here in 1990, and moved up the ladder. Now, let me put his bio back up on the screen here for a second, okay? Because I was told that, so I got this up here. My little thing up on the screen here. Let's get rid of this here. Okay. Back here. Hang on a second. I just want to point something out. Get back up on the screen. Okay. I was told that somewhere prior to 2005, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department changed its policy to disqualify applicants for the rank of captain who had received adjudications for misconduct. This is what I was told. So if what I'm being told is correct, that sometime prior to 2005, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department changed its policy back then that to disqualify applicants for captain who had received adjudications for misconduct, okay? Because you take a promotional exam, you have to be a lieutenant, take a promotional exam to get promoted to captain. And supposedly this policy that changed prior to 2005, if it is correct what I'm being told, that said you can't even take the test for captain because if you had adjudications for misconduct. Well, that's important, ladies and gentlemen, because if that's true, then how did Kevin McMahill get promoted in April 2010 to captain by then corrupt sheriff Doug Gillespie? And I went through Gillespie's history. The cover-up was domestic violence. They falsified, they destroyed evidence in the computer-aided dispatch system. They reissued another event number. So Doug Gillespie is corrupt. Doug Gillespie is the sheriff at the time who promoted Kevin McMahill to captain in April of 2010. So if that policy was in effect in April of 2010, then how did he get promoted? Because we know Kevin McMahill has sustained charges from 1995 of misconduct, conduct unbecoming an officer, neglect of duty, and untruthfulness. So yet Sheriff Doug Gillespie in 2010 promoted him to captain. Now, again, we go back to the September 1990. I brought this up in 2002. Hired as a patrol officer and then served as field training officer, a member of the training academy staff, and then it bounces to March 2001. He's promoted to sergeant. Ladies and gentlemen, it does not list a break in service on the bio, and I said that in episode 102, and we need to find out why. He did not have sustained service from 1990 until he retired in December of 2020. So we need to find out just what the hell's going on with this guy. Now, let's get back to Doug Gillespie. He talks about moving up in rank. He moved up real fast. But where did most of his rank and appointments come from? From corrupt sheriff Doug Gillespie. Because look at his bio. Like I said, April 2010, he's promoted to captain. And like I said in the other podcast, once you get to the rank of captain, deputy chiefs, assistant sheriffs, and undersheriffs are appointed by the elected sheriff. You don't have to take a test. So he took the test for captain, although that memo, or what I'm being told, that policy change in 2005 should have eliminated him from even being promoted to captain, if what I'm being told is true. But then a year later, in September 2011, Sheriff Gillespie appoints him to deputy chief. And then 2 years later, in October 2013, he's appointed to assistant sheriff. And then 1 year later, he's appointed to undersheriff by Sheriff Doug Gillespie. And on January 5th, Joe Lombardo was sworn in as sheriff because he was endorsed by corrupt Sheriff Doug Gillespie, and Joe Lombardo keeps Kevin McMahill as his undersheriff. So that's where most of his appointments and his promotions came from, was from Doug Gillespie. Okay? And you got to remember, he was promoted to captain in April 2010, which was about a year after the cover-up that took place while he was Lieutenant McMahill on Doug Gillespie's domestic violence incident at his house, where they they destroyed records, and then they issued falsified event numbers. It wasn't a falsified event number, a falsified crime to cover for the officers. I brought that up in the other podcast. So that's a little history of Kevin McMahill. Up here, let me get off the screen here. Okay, make sure I covered everything before some more news that's coming out here. I don't want this to run that long. Okay. Okay, so we covered that one. That one over here. Got some notes here. Like I said, I apologize to Tom Roberts. He was not a deputy chief when he retired. He was assistant sheriff. Him and Stan Hyde, retired sergeant, are also running for sheriff against Kevin McMahill. Now, this is what's going through the grapevine. So I'm going to put it out there. Okay, I'm being told that Lombardo is hoping that McMahill wins the majority vote, which is, I think, 51% or 50% plus one vote in the June 14th primary coming up, which would make McMahill the winner. There wouldn't be no runoff until November. If he doesn't get that 50, 51%, whatever it is, then there will be a runoff with him and the other candidates in November. But according to what I'm being told from sources close to Lombardo, Lombardo is hoping that McMahill wins the majority vote in June, so it doesn't go to a runoff for sheriff in November. Should McMahill win the majority vote, 50 or 51%, whatever it is, I think it's 50% plus one in June, if that happens, I'm being told that Lombardo is going to resign as sheriff and asks Clark County Chairwoman Marilyn Kirkpatrick, who's the chairwoman of the Clark County Commission, to immediately appoint Kevin McMahill as sheriff, so McMahill doesn't have to wait until January to take office. So that's what I'm being told. So because I'm being told that Lombardo wants to resign if that happens, to distance himself from the Las Vegas Metro Police while he focuses on running the remaining months for governor against the incumbent governor, Steve Sisolak. So according to what I'm being told, like I said, if Kevin McMahill wins the majority vote in June, on June 14th primary, 50% or 51%, he would immediately be the elected sheriff, but he wouldn't be taking office until January. And Lombardo is going to ask Marilyn Kirkpatrick, from what I'm being told, the chairperson of the Clark County Commission, I guess she can do it, to make a proclamation that Kevin McMahill is the elected sheriff and that he immediately takes over the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department. And then Lombardo is going to resign if that happens, because he wants to distance himself, and I don't know how he's going to distance himself from the police department. He was a freaking sheriff for all these years, a corrupt, lying, incompetent sheriff, but that's what I'm being told. So, let me get that out. A couple other things here. Okay. And this here is, I talked about, and this is what just sources are telling me, I brought up Todd Fasulo, because I guess there's a lot of cops now are upset that, because I said the rumor is that McMahill wants Todd Fasulo, who's now the, I think the vice president of security over at the Wynn, he's his buddy, drinking buddy, pal over the years, to be his number two, whether that's a sworn position or a civilian position, whatever it may be, that's what he wants. A lot of cops are upset about it because they can't stand Fasulo. But one of the guys was saying to me, he says, hey, you know, this event that happened, this incident I'm going to talk about, shows the mentality, the arrogance, and ignorance of retired Sheriff Todd Fasulo. And I guess when he was still in the department before he left, Fasulo was walking with Lombardo, McMahill, and some other people in headquarters. And there were some laborers, some workers there. They were Hispanic, and they were laying tile on the floor. And Lombardo stepped on the tile, and I guess there was something there that says don't walk on it or something. And one of the workers told him, hey, get off the tile, it's set or something like that, and basically blew up at him. And Todd Fasulo, who was there, laid in and went berserk on these workers and just started berating them, saying, do you know who you're talking to? That's the sheriff. You can't be talking to him like that, and was really into these guys. And then, I don't know, somebody else was there, said, hey, back off because they don't work for us. They're civilian employees. So, they said Fasulo blew a cork. That was actually the terminology the person told me this, no pun intended, and berated the workers, screaming at them, quote, something like, do you know who you're yelling at? That's the sheriff. And you can't talk to him like that. And I guess Lombardo, got off the tile and something. But they said this is just the attitude. It shows the attitude and the arrogance and the ignorance of Todd Fasulo. So I guess that incident happened, and that's what I was being told. I want to make sure I covered everything over here. Check my paperwork, my notes. Okay. 41 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, appreciate you listening. I got so much stuff coming out. I just did a little teaser video about another cover-up, but I've talked about it. And as we get closer to the massacre, I'll be breaking a lot of these stories. Kevin McMahill and Sheriff Lombardo's cover-up of who leaked the crime scene photos, the Paddock crime scene photos to the press, cover-ups involving other coward cops who failed to act that night, more stuff coming out on the the unsolved 2016 Land Kaufman murders that happened on Lombardo's and McMahill's watch while they were in command. And anybody that's been following my work for years knows that case is riddled with allegations of police corruption, misconduct, incompetence. It's a freaking disgrace. Metropolitan Police Department in Las Vegas does not want to solve that case for a bunch of reasons. So we got more stuff coming on that. More lies about the massacre. I brought up, and it's one of my episodes back. I'll have the links in the description section of this episode, where McMahill went on national television and lied about the massacre when he said that the shooting stopped when the breach team was in the hallway getting the bracket off the door. And that was on a Fox News interview that he did. That was an all-out freaking lie because the shooting stopped an hour before. Lombardo making statements that they wanted to get into the room quick because they didn't want Paddock reloading or firing open fire. We know that wasn't true. That was a lie. And I got all these videos on my YouTube channel because they didn't go into the room for an hour and 5 freaking minutes. So where was the concern for the safety? And at the end of last year, that's on my podcast also, on my YouTube channel, where Lombardo is now saying that Paddock committed suicide while the breach team, Levi Hancock and his ad hoc team, were at the door trying to breach the door to get in. That's when he committed suicide. When the investigation that everybody's done in the police department, including their own preliminary report, said that he committed suicide almost immediately after he stopped firing. So now he's changing the narrative on that. So much stuff more coming out relating to the Las Vegas massacre. Remember, this year, October 1st, is the 5-year anniversary of the October 1st massacre. So I got a lot of stuff coming out that I've never published before. Be going back and rehashing some stories I broke for the Baltimore Post-Examiner. Remember, I broke about 165 stories on the Las Vegas massacre for the Baltimore Post-Examiner, more than any other journalist in the country, and debunked a lot of conspiracy theories and rumors and a bunch of nonsense that was out there that just wasn't true. So I'll be rehashing a lot of that stuff. Prior to the election is the 5th year anniversary of the massacre, to the election for governor and if sheriffs, if they don't win in the primary, whoever gets the majority vote. And we also have 6-year anniversary, October, of the unsolved Land Kaufman double homicide. That's still, like I said, unsolved to this day. So there's a lot of stuff coming out. I'll be talking more about people who were arrested for murder and other criminal charges, while McMahill and Lombardo were in office that were totally innocent and destroyed people's lives. One gentleman even died. I'll be talking about that and more stuff. Ladies and gentlemen, I tell people you vote for who you want to vote for. The police department, I guess, and the unions are all backing Lombardo for governor. They're backing McMahill. And like somebody said, what do you expect, Doug? Police officers are all liars. So, of course, they're going to back Kevin McMahill, a documented pervert and liar. What do you expect? And I would say this. Not all police officers are liars. I was a cop. I wasn't a liar. I lost my job because I didn't lie. But yes, it's bewildering that with what goes on in that police department, because sources are talking to me. I broke all these stories. McMahill and Lombardo's cover-up of the rape of the 12-year-old girl in 2019 that happened because of the incompetence in 2018. They were both involved in that cover-up, and so were other high-ranking officials in the police department. Ordering police officers, Lombardo and McMahill, to falsify police reports to lower crime statistics. Okay? I broke all these stories. Both of these guys, like I said, are complicit in one cover-up after another. And cops are telling me these things, including high-ranking police officials who have talked to me. And yet, if you believe the union, the majority of the police officers want Joe Lombardo to run the state of Nevada and want Kevin McMahill to be the next sheriff. Okay? We got to break this chain. Okay? We always had, in the past 30 years that I've been in Vegas, hand-picked sheriff by the incumbent sheriff. And they win because they get the money, because they get the support of the incumbent sheriff. We have to break the chain this year. Otherwise, nothing is going to stop here at Metro. It's still going to be cover-ups, and it's still going to be misconduct. And if that's what the majority of the police officers on this department want, then stop complaining to me and other people who don't do anything about it when they talk to them about it. But I do. When I get the information, I vet it, and I do my podcast. That's how I uncover these cover-ups. Then if you want to support a documented liar and documented pervert, okay, then don't be complaining to me when he gets in office and these cover-ups and these lies continue. Because if you're supporting a man who is a documented liar, then you deserve everything you get when he's running the police department. And that's all I got to say on that. Ladies and gentlemen, it's April 11, 2022, 23:47 hours. That's the way it is. That's what Walter Cronkite said when I was a kid. And that's the way it is, ladies and gentlemen. April 11, 2022, 23:47 hours from the desert of Las Vegas. This is the Truth and Consequences podcast with Doug Poppa. Remember to subscribe to my YouTube channel by hitting the red subscribe button. If you want to donate, I'm self-funded. PayPal.me/Doug Poppa. I know times are tough. You don't have any money. That's fine. At least subscribe to my channel. And then my audio podcast available on a bunch of platforms, including Spotify, iHeartRadio, Radio Public, Google Podcast, and the rest. Thanks for listening, ladies and gentlemen. See you on the next one. Remember, the stuff that I'm talking about here, you will not hear the Las Vegas media talking about it, or for some damn reason, even following up on anything that I've been breaking for years. But that's not going to stop me from doing what I am doing. Thank you, and good evening.